Welcome to Market Mastermind Trading Group. This is Cedar, and our group coaching session today is anchored VWAP and my favorite indicator, the combination of AVWAP and standard deviations. So I do have two streams running. For those of you just coming in, you can watch the 30-minute execution chart for ES on the live stream account. You can pop that out if you want to have both of them playing on your screens. Pop that out and then join this stream from the voice channel, and you'll be able to see what I'm looking at in both places. So before I get started, I want to make sure that you guys can see my stream in the right place, because last time it was not up and you were listening to what I said for the first couple of minutes and not able to see it. So I just want to make sure that it's not the same. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Kings. All right. So this is a bear chart for me, just has volume on the bottom. I keep the VRVP from our last group coaching there and available, but for right now, for our purposes, we're going to go ahead and keep that invisible. If I were doing this myself to look at an analysis, I would have the VRVP on, but I want to try to keep it a little more focused on anchored VWAP. So visible range volume profile is the volume that I use to set my supply and demand levels, to see where buyers and sellers have been in the past. And that is our first group coaching session that we recorded about a week ago. So if you missed that, the replay is available in the Discord group under group coaching in the education section. So when we're using anchored VWAP, I'm going to go ahead and just add a new indicator. And there are a bunch of them. One I like is anchored VWAP and standard deviations, created by Rumpy Pumpy. Click it one time to get it added to the chart. Then we're going to go in and check our settings. All right, so our default was to our session profile. So we can start with that because our session is what's streamed in the 30-minute execution chart, and it's probably requiring the most adjustment of anything because it is changed each day. So these are our settings for the current day. I set them at market close yesterday. So 1800 hours, Globex open last night, and every day at market close, I change them. So they're not going to show up because we're on a daily time frame here. I'll go ahead and move out to the 30-minute. And it's a nice visual representation of expansion, contraction, consolidation. A lot of times you'll see them come wide and then kind of drape out. This shows our expansion. So when you're watching standard deviations, I have them set, and actually I need to go back into that so you can double click on the indicator itself. I have a couple of differences that I put together. The default on this indicator is half standard deviations. So this would be 0.5, 1, 1.5, 2. So I go in and I change all of those. And then I save it each day. If you accidentally hit reset settings, it's going to default this back from 1 through 8 to 0.5 through 4. And that is the default on the indicator. If you ever do reset it, you'll just have to go back in and change them to what these settings are. I did that back in early 2022 as I started talking about leptocritic distribution. No, it was the fall of 21, expanding volatility. And definition behind leptocritic distribution is 3 standard deviations of movement. And there are different types of distribution. That is the bell curve that the volume trades on. And it just is a fancy term for volatility. And very unusual trading time for us to actually see. Sometimes we see 6, 7, and 8 standard deviations of movement. And that is highly unusual. So hopefully we don't get too used to it before it contracts back, presuming it most likely will as we come out of the presidential election cycle that we're in. But for the meantime, it's pretty easy to just visually go, well, there's my half standard deviation below anchored VWAP, right? So I have this potential range. So when you look at the anchor point of being 1800 hours, it doesn't start to render anchored VWAP, and that the anchored VWAP is the first thing that shows up about 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then the bands start to show up at about 8 o'clock. So just because we have it anchored at the Globex open, it starts to collect data in this time frame. It doesn't start to render. So it's not going to be very helpful for you if you're needing it off of the Globex open. I tend to not trade that time, similar to setting the IB. I want to see if I'm going to trade Globex, I want to see what that anchored VWAP opens as. There is a pretty strong tendency to sell anchored VWAP when it first renders. And I haven't, gone and like tracked metrics over many months, but something that I've just noticed as are they selling anchored VWAP again right as it renders? And there are so many different charting platforms. TradingView renders at that time or starts rendering anchored VWAP. I don't know about the other platforms, so it could just be coincidental the times that I've looked at it. But if you like to look for patterns, I would be interested if that's something that you also see. So we use them as they really are, because we're using volume weight adjusted price. That's what VWAP is. And then anchored is in reference to where we put it in at the beginning of that Globex session. It becomes tradable until the standard deviations are at greater than a 45-degree angle. And so these levels will trade in channels, for instance, between anchored VWAP and second standard deviation from 8 a.m. wicked underneath it to first standard deviation. So we traded 3 standard deviations today, by and large, and can be used. I know people that trade off this chart right here only with nothing else, purely the standard deviation levels in relation to anchored VWAP, and anchored VWAP being the mean reversion piece of that. Now, for me, if I were going to be a volume purist, I would have to have the SVP indicator added to that. So that I could see where value area high, value area low, and volume point of control is. And it might be an interesting test for you if you're finding that you're having a hard time seeing the charts more clearly, to just have this up. So this example right here, let me zoom out a little bit. I actually have up for ES and NQ with 3 days visible on my large monitor in 2 of the corners, so that I can see where they are in relation to anchored VWAP very clearly, where value area is over the last couple days. And oftentimes I'll actually even have more days than that up, 3, 4, 5, somewhere in there. I kind of want to just see what the general tempo is, but for our purposes, we're looking to see trend of your volume point of control in relation to anchored VWAP on this session. So we have a higher volume point of control and an upward sloping anchored VWAP. So when you hear me say we've got an upward sloping anchored VWAP, I can't be short for long. It's because it is a directional move. If I've got a flat anchored VWAP, then we just trade the levels from a horizontal perspective. And if we've got a downward sloping anchored VWAP, if you're long, they are shorter trades. So they help us predict the intraday direction. And it is one of the most dependable ways to be able to look at higher time frame from the intraday swing kind of perspective. And it is what the institutional traders are judged off of, how their execution is in relation to anchored VWAP. So if we're underneath anchored VWAP and pop up to it, the closest that you can sell short in relation to anchored VWAP, the better the trade would be, and vice versa. If we're above anchored VWAP, the closest you can buy above anchored VWAP, the better the execution is judged to be. So following that, I figure if it's good enough for the institutionals, it's probably good enough for me. So back to my point, if you're finding that your charts are too cluttered, you have too many lines, too many different things, I showed you how to turn the drawings off and on with the VRVP indicator. So you can do that, but I would actually heavily recommend that if you have the screen availability to have a chart like this up for, oops, sounds like we've got somebody unmuted. Give me just a sec. Got a hot mic. Okay, got that. And if you want me to unmute it later, I can take the server mute off. I just don't want to have people hearing something you don't want them to hear on the recording. All right. Okay, so heavily recommend having a relatively bare chart available with just volume-based data, which is what this is. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off SVP because this session is not necessarily about it, but just to give you an idea of what I look at in my less busy trading charts. If you're watching the ES 30-minute execution chart right now, you can see the volume point of control is getting whipped around. It's moving back and forth live. So interesting to see this volume being put in right now above the July anchored VWAP. So we're going to move into some different dates. I'm going to go ahead and minimize this one. Next one I want to look at is already on my chart. Actually, let me go out to daily. This is another chart that I have up and visible at all times. This is my ES daily chart. There we go. And as far as settings go, and you can edit your settings in TradingView by going to the drop-down menu and selecting the gearbox. So drop down gearbox over here for settings, or I'm all about the just hover over the indicator and select it. So I anchor my yearly the last day of the year at 1800 hours. So the same as I do the session Globex, because the Globex open coming into January 1st is actually December 31st at 1800 hours. And if that happens to fall on a weekend, it will still anchor it as that first data set starts to come out. This is one of the most powerful tools that you'll probably ever put on your charts for the much bigger picture. So you can see right here, there's the eyeball concept of a half standard deviation. So our bounce, when we had our 3 days of selling, was like hand grenades and horseshoes. We're going to call it right at the 1.5 standard deviation, close enough, because I can eyeball the difference between 1 standard and 2 standard, and I don't have to have them so compressed. So we have held anchored VWAP on daily closes all year long. We stayed in between the 1st and 2nd standard deviation until April, sold down, tested underneath anchored VWAP, and could not close a second daily candle underneath for continuation. So if you're concerned that you're short in the hole, this can really help you get an idea. So ideally, I think what people were looking for is a 2 standard deviation move, similar to what we saw here. So 2nd standard deviation down to anchored VWAP. And I think that partially is why so many people were so short, which is what fueled this bounce. And that's where people, refer to it as a dead cat bounce. The shorts are who keep the market up. If shorting were outlawed, ES would be at about 1,000 because there wouldn't be any buyers because everyone would be scared. What happens with shorts when they're executing in relation to like a yearly type of anchored VWAP is they're the first buyers because it's the lowest risk buy to close a position. So we as momentum longs watch for the shorts to cover, see if there's some continuation, hop on the train for the ride, which is what we're seeing today, that little bit of bounce up. And ultimately, if you wanted to just say, okay, where's the top of the potential of this move? What did we do the last time we came up against the second standard deviation? Had some rejection, and then our cute little June pop over. So we now have a failure to touch the third standard deviation all year long. So watching the half standard deviations might start to come back into play after the end of this year as we're starting to see them respected a little bit more closely. But I will do that later because it does obscure the chart a little bit more. Now, the next one that we can do is a monthly. And that would be June 30th at 1800 hours. So now here's our July anchored VWAP. And you can see we've got 2 standard deviations above and below anchored VWAP as our trading channels. So using this as one of your ways to look left may prove to be very helpful if you're struggling finding direction. I know we have a lot of volatility, a lot of whippy moves happening right now, and that is why you're seeing me take longer dated options along with the golden flow that's coming up. So siding with larger size traders in the much larger positions, not just a couple 100,000, but millions. And it's in relation to how we're performing within these higher time frames, monthly. You can do quarterly anchored VWAPs. And there is a anchored VWAP book that I have in our education channel by Brian Shannon that will take you down the rabbit hole if you're interested in more about anchored VWAP beyond what we're doing in today's session. I have found that I have gone both directions where I'll only do Globex anchored VWAP all the way through high of the day anchored VWAPs, high of the week anchored VWAPs, and it starts to get to be a little bit too much information for me and you get analysis paralysis. So if you're finding yourself having a hard time, less is always better. So I've kind of gone back to the center where I always have my session anchored VWAP. I always know where this is. I have this marked. I keep it on my mobile device so that I can check it through the day and see where my month anchored VWAP is. It starts to become more helpful later in the month, but it will render within the first couple of days. And then I always have the other chart up that has the yearly anchored VWAP. So next one we're going to look at is all-time high anchored VWAP. So we've got our default. I save it every day as the new default. That way I don't have to put it in on all my devices if I add a new chart or open a new category. So I'm going to move this to a 5-minute chart. Actually, I'm just going to go ahead and take it out to a 1 minute. And those of you that have followed me for a while know that I really don't look at 1-minute charts, but in order to find our all-time high, I anchor to the minute of all-time high. There it is. So we have Thursday, July 11th at 8:33 a.m. Eastern Standard. So that is where we're going to anchor that. I'm not going to save that as a default because sometimes it changes 9 days in a row like we saw earlier this month. Kind of entertaining stuff. And I'm going to take it back out to daily. Roll the chart forward. And there's our all-time high anchored VWAP. Definitely more useful as we spend more time in relation or distance from the day. When we were setting those new all-time highs through this channel, it was, do we have a higher, hold on. We've got to make sure, high. Yep, we have a new all-time high that I need to double check and make sure that I've got in here. So I'm going to drop a horizontal line in. I was trying to do it off memory, but I do believe that memory is not correct. So back to the 1 minute chart. Okay, here we go. Interesting on this one actually, because we touch it in both places. I consider that a back test. So I'm going to anchor it to Tuesday, July 16th at 15:55 in the afternoon. So this is where the cross check is very handy. There we go. Voila. There is one change that I make with all-time high anchored VWAP in the indicator. Well, maybe. Oh, 11:16. Ah, there we go. And that is, I leave the yellow as my anchored VWAP on the other time frames, but on the all-time high, I actually change it from yellow to fuchsia, especially when we have times like right now, it's not that far away potentially from what our current session anchored VWAP could potentially be. All right, so ironically, we're hovering right around our all-time high anchored VWAP, and we have contracting standard deviations. So that is what would be considered a coiling compressing, probably preparing for a move pretty dramatically one direction or the other. We did just see some pretty dramatic selling in ES, moved from the July anchored VWAP down into our all-time high anchored VWAP, which is what you're seeing on my screen here, back inside the previous day's range. So if this helps you see a little bit more of that high time frame, then it's definitely a good idea to have them. You just want to make sure that you don't have all of them visible on your charts, or you end up with chaos. It's the squiggle lines. There we go. But that purple still does stick out a little bit more. All right, so I'm going to go back to July anchored VWAP. And VRVP to tie in the last group coaching session. So we want to have all of that volume visible. So here's our high volume node that we would be watching as overhead resistance from VRVP. And if you notice, it is just above anchored VWAP. So that execution concept of judged by their execution in relation to anchored VWAP being short anchored VWAP. From the monthly perspective, that's how fast way to double check it, is worth noting. So holding between anchored VWAP and first standard deviation below with a high volume node above is what a lot of people are watching and worth adding to your repertoire. So I am just going to double check and make sure. I do have one other indicator on here that I don't use a whole bunch. I haven't updated it since March. I'll go ahead and show you that one. Actually, I have two. So here is, it's called VWAP bands, and I only show the VWAP on that one, not the standard deviations. It auto anchors it by the weekly or by the month. I have not found it to be as useful personally, probably because I'm used to watching. I'm going to readjust my execution chart as we sell off here. That way you guys can see the lower ranges. We have value area low on the session underneath us as support, just above yesterday's 4 p.m. close. And then the other one that I've been multiple anchored VWAP. All right, so if I wanted to have a session anchored VWAP, then I would go July 22nd at 6 p.m. Then a weekly anchored VWAP. And this is if I just wanted the VWAP from each of the dates that we talked about earlier and not have the standard deviations on. I find the standard deviations extremely helpful and would rather have separate charts with them. But Sunday, this chart is weird that it starts with Monday. I don't like those, but it is what it is. 1800 hours from Sunday night, and then monthly, and then that one is our yearly. So I set up these categories. We've got yellow as the session anchored VWAP, blue as the weekly, purple as the monthly, white as the yearly. And monthly is not showing for some reason, but you get the idea of having multiples on the chart. If we did happen to get down into these ranges, it would be very helpful to be able to quickly identify that you are getting near the yearly anchored VWAP. And reminder, I don't use a 12-month rolling anchored VWAP. I use from the beginning of the year. I know some people who do love a yearly rolling. That's just too far out of data for me because of where recent trade happens. So let's see if we can figure out why. Try to change colors here, see if oh, that would be why, because it's July. There we go. So it didn't render because I had it set at the end of July instead of the end of June. So just another nice quick reference point, depending on what you want on your charts. Okay, there is my final. Any questions as far as anchored VWAP or in relation to how I use them? Question, at what point in time does that January 1st anchored VWAP become no longer relevant as time slowly spreads the standard deviations? I use it all year long until the end of the year, all the whole year. And it seems, I mean, obviously you're not bumping into them as much on a year that we have higher highs, or lower lows, as the case may be, but we don't see that all the time. And so what I found is that I will still pay attention to it because oftentimes just anchored VWAP and half standard deviation and one standard deviation can be very relevant right into mid to late December. And maybe that's why people keep a 12-month rolling on. I just have never found it to be as actionable, so I avoid it. again, back to paralysis by analysis, too many things to look at. So you kind of have to filter through, find out what things help you see the markets more clearly. And always make sure you're going back to just your bear chart and asking yourself, would this have helped me to have less information or more information? Is there something that I missed? And that's where I started really digging into anchored VWAP, was I'm missing something by just using volume and volume profile. There's some pretty heavy relevance around volume being king. PA is the expression of where volume is trading. And so critical that you're not over analyzing, but that you're not missing the bigger picture of how your overall volume is expressed, because we need to be trading what other people are trading, and that has standard deviation. Was resistance on the horizontal line and then became support in our recent little sell program. All right, checking to see if there's any more questions. And it looks like we are good. All right, guys, thanks for hanging out. I am going to go ahead and end the recording, and we'll get the topic for next week set up inside the event, inside Discord, and I will see you on Voice for Trading here shortly.